Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the unceded lands and waters on which we live, work, and depend. We recognise all First Nations peoples around the world and celebrate their enduring connections to country and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Welcome to the next series of I Think You're on Mute, where we will be looking at pressing issues as they arise and hopefully introduce you to some ideas and perspectives you haven't considered. In this episode, we dive into the heart of one of the most pressing humanitarian landscapes in the world today, Bangladesh. A country of contrasts, Bangladesh is celebrated for its rapid economic growth, resilient communities, and robust disaster management frameworks. Yet it's also a land grappling with profound vulnerabilities, political upheaval, climate risks, and humanitarian challenges that test the limits of even the most resilient systems.
Bangladesh is off to the polls, but the result seems a foregone conclusion.
Our Prime Minister will be re-elected again. Even a storm can't stop her.
There's one notable thing missing: an opposition.
This is a one-sided election. You can't clap with one hand.
A boycott of the election by the government's main opposition all but guarantees another sweep to power for Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. For decades, politics in the country has been dominated by rival dynasties, led by Prime Minister Hasina and former PM Khaleda Zia. Zia's currently on house arrest, fighting what she says are trumped-up corruption charges. There are no prizes for guessing the winner of this contest. Meghna Bali, ABC News, Dhaka.
The election in Bangladesh is over. The ruling Awami League returned to power, but the protests will not go away. The opposition Bangladesh National Party, which led a nationwide strike on Sunday, has demanded a second walkout and for the poll to be declared null and void.
The political landscape in Bangladesh has undergone a seismic shift in the past year. In January 2024, the Awami League secured another 5-year term, only for Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to resign amid protests 8 months later. An interim government now faces a trifecta of challenges: political, economic, and security instability. These developments reverberate deeply across the humanitarian system, which is intricately linked to national and subnational governance. Bangladesh has long been a global model in disaster preparedness, thanks to its cyclone preparedness program and local disaster management committees. Yet, the gaps are glaring. Power remains centralised in Dhaka, sidelining local leadership when it matters most. Humanitarian funding is shrinking as the country approaches middle-income status. And data systems? They're struggling, leaving many unseen and unheard during moments of crisis. The new report we're unpacking today highlights 4 critical areas for reform. Firstly, decentralisation and local leadership. Secondly, professionalisation and data systems. Thirdly, coordination and financing. And lastly, taking a nexus approach. Firstly, decentralised decision-making has stifled innovation and transparency. The call is clear: shift the power to the grassroots, enabling communities to lead disaster responses tailored to their unique context. Secondly, on professionalisation and data systems, from Dhaka to the district level, the need for expertise is dire. Disaster management officers often lack the training to collect and act on the disaggregated data needed for inclusive responses. On coordination and financing, Bangladesh's dual humanitarian systems, the government and international, too often work in silos, duplicating efforts and wasting resources. Meanwhile, international funding is expected to decline by 2031, urging the adoption of innovative financing models. On the nexus approach, our favourite word, nexus, in places like Cox's Bazar, where over 1 million Rohingya refugees reside, short-term fixes dominate, while sustainable, integrated solutions lag. Addressing these issues requires a cohesive approach connecting humanitarian aid, development, and peace building. And here's where it gets personal. This is not just a story of systems and statistics. It's about people, flood survivors who've waited too long for aid, women and youth excluded from decision making, and local leaders fighting for their communities' voices to be heard. In this episode, we'll hear directly from those on the ground, explore the report's proposed solutions, and challenge ourselves to think differently about how we can support a more equitable, efficient, and localised humanitarian response. Because at the heart of this discussion is a belief that the solutions to these challenges already exist within the communities they're designed to help. So grab a cup of tea, settle in, and join us as we navigate the complexities, challenges, and opportunities of Bangladesh's humanitarian future. Hello, I'm so pleased to be joined today by Dr. Ehsanur Rahman, an advisor of the National Alliance of Humanitarian Actors in Bangladesh. And he's also a convening committee member of the CSO Alliance. Dr. Rahman, could you please introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Hello, this is Ehsan. The short name is better to pronounce, to discuss, to talk. As you said, okay, I'm working closely with the National Alliance of Humanitarian Actors, which is NAHAB. So for the short name is okay for us to talk. This is an alliance of the humanitarian national non-government organizations working in Bangladesh. And I have been the founding chairperson, and now I'm the advisory capacity working. In Bangladesh, there is also an alliance on which I'm in the convening committee, the Civil Society Alliance, Civil Society Organizations Alliance, CSO Alliance, which takes the overall non-state actors together. So I'm connected in both. It's a pleasure to meet you all.
Thank you so much, Ehsan. And I think we are so lucky to have you today because you are connected in to these different organisations and coordination platforms. And the first question that I would like to ask you is about those coordination platforms. And what hope do you see for change in Bangladesh when it comes to local humanitarian actors and the way in which they're coordinating in the next few years?
That's a journey we started since Bangladesh is a disaster-prone country. We have been facing disasters, natural disasters mostly. So our target is to build a resilient community so that they can take care of themselves. That's why we are giving much emphasis on the local level coordination and local level leadership in addressing the catastrophe or crisis, what happens, whether it's a cyclone, flood, or any other type, so that people can take leadership and the decisions can be made. At present, it's largely centrally managed and coordinated. So we want to make a change from the central to the ground level. And that's one part. On the CSO as a whole, on the civil society sector, in Bangladesh, there is a big change in going on now. A lot of reforms are going on because of this change in the government system. So many reform agendas are coming, and also in the humanitarian sector, we are taking initiative to bring that changes in the sector as a whole. When we're talking about decentralization, it doesn't work in a particular sector alone. So there need to be changes across the sector. So that is one also we are keeping in mind.
How does, when that power is centralised, how does that impact the local humanitarian actors who you work with? And how does it affect those disaster affected populations?
Yeah, there are two dimensions of that. We as a NAHAB, as an alliance of humanitarian actors, we work with the local actors who are Bangladeshi, who closely work with the communities which are get affected because of this cyclone or flood or other natural disasters. So one aspect is the practices which are required in that particular context. If it's because of flood, because of river erosion, for example, then whole steps and strategies would be different when the flood is a flash flood which comes because of heavy rainfall in the upstream. So that's why the local actors really are familiar with those contexts, and the communities live with that. So working closely with the affected communities is very important for us, and that can be done only if the local actors get enough opportunities or spaces to take decision at that level. And there lies the coordination among the humanitarian actors as well as from the external agencies which goes to help the people is very important over there.
Yes, I agree. It's both within the system, it's both the international agencies and those local agencies. So I'm interested in understanding that big shift, that big systems change. What are your hopes of that being able to occur? So, how do you feel that there are going to be sort of durable humanitarian solutions and change in Bangladesh in the future?
Yes, system change is a big area where really we all need to work because we all are part of the system, whether we work at the ground level, we work at the subnational level, national level, international level, or even who are coming with the financial support, the donors, private sectors, all are part of the system. At the end, we want to establish an accountability mechanism in the system so that everybody feels accountable to the affected community to bring changes in their life so that they can recover, they can go back to their business recovery, their business loss. So that part is in the prime. But in many systems, still the accountability element is not established. So that is an area agenda we are talking on that so that people feel that okay, that's the prime part. Unless there is a change in the life of the affected community, whole efforts support or rehabilitation or recovery support what comes, those come on a sporadic basis. For the systemic changes, we want to make this humanitarian system as part of the development agenda so that it's not in isolation, supporting some people for some days for food or with non-food item or some shelters as an ad hoc basis. So far, humanitarian services are short span. So we want to make this part of this local development initiative. So that is another big agenda. If you want to bring system, that system has to be really to cover the development initiatives as well.
And I would love to ask you, Ehsan, I'm glad that you raised the piece around accountability. What would be one piece of advice that you would give to local humanitarian actors in Bangladesh to help boost their work around accountability to affected communities?
The first responders are always the local actors, whether they are the local NGO or a private business or the neighbor. Traditionally, the support to the affected community, affected households uh, are there. That we call consider that we consider as a part of our heritage. So to them, it comes absolutely from humanitarian point of view to help the people. So whenever the next round of supports come from the central, from the national or international communities, we want to spread that spirit to that level so that it comes uh, to their mind always what ultimately the benefit or effect are this supports going bringing to the life of the people, the community, whether it's a communication that comes on the roads and bridge, whether it's shelter, then it comes from the household level. When there needs support for people or with persons with disabilities, their needs of support, need for supports are different, but at the end all planning has to be around the house we are supporting, around the family or around the person we are supporting. That need to be at the top of the list.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think you've articulated that so well because it doesn't matter how long we talk about system change or humanitarian reform, this is the whole reason why we're doing this, is to provide better services and better assistance for those who need it most. Thank you so much, Dr. Rahman, for your insights today. It's been really, really interesting hearing about your perspective, and we wish you all the best with your work that you're doing in Bangladesh. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this initiative and help us connecting each other in different part of the world. Thank you.
I'm so pleased to welcome Farah Kabir to the podcast. Farah is the Country Director for ActionAid Bangladesh. Farah, could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hi, Beth. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Farah Kabir. I'm the Country Director of ActionAid Bangladesh, and we are working on a rights-based approach, but we have a strong humanitarian program. ActionAid actually came to Bangladesh because of a humanitarian response way back in the 80s. And we are now 40 years in this country, and it's become more a national program as well. We are a very rights-based feminist organization looking at community strength and people power and creating these humanitarian response as a part of community action as well. So it's not like we just go in and give them some food support and shelter support and then walk away. It's more about building resilience. As you know, Bangladesh is very vulnerable to climate induced disasters. There are human induced disasters, development disasters, and we have tried to work around them, build community resilience. So our focus very much is on localization and working with community, respecting their indigenous knowledge, looking for solutions from the grassroots and nature-based solutions.
Yes, we've always been impressed with the work that ActionAid does around shifting the power. And I suppose my first question touches on this a bit. I'd be very interested, as in your role as being a country director with ActionAid Bangladesh, what are your hopes of, for building durable humanitarian solutions for humanitarian challenges in Bangladesh?
So my hope is, given that Bangladesh is a very resilient, and the way we have been able to gain the trust of the community, we need to prioritize localization, work to build climate resilience communities through adaptation initiatives. And we must remember that Bangladesh is host to 1.2 billion Rohingya refugees. So the refugee support, the humanitarian crisis there, which has now become a protracted crisis. But all this requires an integrated humanitarian approach. So we have also evolved as a country, our government and different political actors and stakeholders. But there's a lot more to do in terms of integration and working with a complementary intersectoral approach.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to ask you about what some of the barriers are that you face to actually have this integrated approach and a localized approach. What's difficult in doing that for you?
So Bangladesh, in some ways, it's centralized. So decision making and actions and budgets come from the center. So the localization or decentralization of power does play up in different occasions. But given that Bangladesh has now developed these skills, so humanitarian response and the different stakeholders are very prompt and they do respond immediately. But, you have to have a plan and you need to be in an organized manner. And when you are challenged by repeated disasters, for instance, in September 2024, we had floods in a part of eastern Bangladesh, eastern northern Bangladesh. And that community had not experienced flood in 30-35 years. So all the anticipatory work, the preparedness, community-based disaster preparedness, has been going on, but not necessarily in that particular location and community, because they had not faced such floods in 3 decades plus. So this is when it becomes a challenge, when we see the new humanitarian requirements coming up for communities who are not prepared. So capacity can be an issue. One of the major issues is we have limited resources, and we spend huge amount of our GDP national budget for disaster response, because in this September flood, communities lost their homes, the roads, their crop, their cattle, the livelihood. There was water shortage, so it's not easy. So funding gaps, and when you do get some funds, they are always very short term, immediate funds from development partners. So that is an issue. And then in the situation like the Rohingya refugee crisis, it's very difficult to keep the attention on the Rohingyas, and sometimes there's donor fatigue. Sometimes there are too many crises going on around the world where there's competing priorities, so development partners have to prioritize. So that is an issue. I think when we are looking at decentralizing and localizing, there's a power issue. And as a feminist organization, this is something we keep challenging, the breaking down of this power hierarchy. It should be positive power within, instead of, based on the bureaucracy or hierarchy and so on. So that's a challenge. But we have seen a shift towards a bottom-up approach. So I am very positive on that. So that is a challenge. Then whatever we do, we are extremely climate vulnerable. The sea levels are rising, extreme weather patterns are increasing, causing displacement, loss of food, water security, livelihood. So this is a very, very a big challenge for us. Then, when we are looking at the different composition, the demography and composition of communities affected, we have found that marginalized groups, women, indigenous communities, young people, persons with disability may not immediately be included, or they face certain amount of exclusion. And then there's coordination issue. With a lot of good intention, people jump in, but it doesn't work like that. It has to be planned, chalked out, agreed, and so that coordination is critical for a humanitarian response. So that is also a problem. And then if you are a part of a community which is far flung in different difficult, hard to reach areas, information may not reach. In the case of the September floods, even with army and helicopters, they could not reach a lot of the communities. They were in such hard to reach places. So these challenges are a reality on the ground.
Oh, thank you. There's some great examples there that really paint a picture of how complex and challenging things are in Bangladesh. You did mention, Farah, there around the resourcing piece, and I would like to ask you, because so many of us at the moment are facing real constraints on the resourcing side. I'd love to ask you about innovative solutions that exist to addressing this current funding crisis. And, what could different actors do about that? So, for example, governments or civil society or international actors, what roles can they play in tackling that challenge?
The government, of course, is mandated and has to serve its citizens, but it does have a resource constraint. And with the national budget constantly being drawn into humanitarian response, it does face a big challenge. But having said that, I think the government can plan and allocate a certain percentage of that budget at the what we call the district level or at the local level for immediate local response. Because before the national actors get to the communities, it's the local groups, it's the local civil society organizations, women's group, youth group. And so if there is a certain percentage of fund provided, and then we would like to see an integration with the social responsibility or what is known as CSR funding for disaster response. And in the long term, different resilience program will support such initiatives. The civil society and NGOs have an important role to play because sometimes they are the first responders along with the women, along with the youth. And so funding mechanism, which is easily accessible by small organizations, women-led organizations, is going to be critical for solutions. And in terms of innovative solution funding, we think that at the global level, the loss and damage fund, climate finance is going to be critical and important. Instead of haggling and, every year we are at the climate conference and we are having to put up the different cases and the 100 billion for adaptation never came through. Then at the last climate conference, they talked about 300 billion. Well, we need to see that fund rolling out. The private sector has to understand that their businesses, their infrastructure are not safe. So we had to spend a lot of time developing a relationship with the private sector, the different chamber of commerce and industry, to support early warning systems and to get them engaged in recovery efforts. Because if you're a manufacturer and you're selling a product, and if the community is disrupted, they're in knee high or in waterlogging situations, they're not going to buy your product. So now they see the rationale and the logic of why they need to be part of these initiatives. So whether it's early warning or recovery efforts. So that is where the private sector needs to play an important role. And in fact, our government has always highlighted that 80% of funding should come from the private sector and the rest from public resources. And then for the development partners, it is important that they provide blended finance models, cooperate with tech companies and venture capitalists, and expand the pool funding mechanism, because it's not going to suffice to say, well, we don't have so much money, or we can't, we are here for profit making, we're here for a particular agenda, and this is the only available resources for social responsibility. I think they have to understand, and this is where we need to work together through the media, through government policymakers, that no one is safe unless all of us are safe.
Oh, that is so well said, Farah. I love what you've painted there about a really interconnected system, really, that is going to be providing that resourcing into the future and the advocacy that we all need to do to ensure that happens. Thank you so much, Farah. Thank you so much for joining the podcast and for sharing these invaluable insights about what's happening at the moment in Bangladesh and what we can expect into the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've heard humanitarian actors share their hopes for increased empowerment of local actors and a shift towards local decision-making, ensuring that affected populations have a strong voice in shaping solutions that affect them. And we've explored the potential actions to address these challenges to support and prioritise a more equitable, efficient and localised humanitarian response in Bangladesh. I really encourage you to read the new report, A Window of Opportunity, Priorities for Humanitarian System Reform in Bangladesh, to dive into the opportunities arising for the humanitarian sector to strengthen systems, processes and partnerships. This episode was made possible by the Humanitarian Rapid Research Initiative, commissioned and supported by the UK Humanitarian Innovation Hub, with funding from the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. The views shared in this episode are those of the speakers alone and do not necessarily reflect the positions of the organisations they represent. This podcast was produced and recorded by Room 3, a production company that works with not-for-profits and social enterprises, and supported by Green Letter Communications.